A monolithic alien puzzle defied every supercomputer in the galaxy for centuries. On his screen, Dr. Aris Thorne watched the latest attempt end in catastrophic failure. The most powerful artificial intelligence ever built, known as Oracle Prime, shuddered under an impossible cognitive load. Its core logic processors melted into digital gibberish, another brilliant mind broken by the enigma. Aris leaned close to his colleague, his voice a low whisper carrying a terrifying insight. He did not see a language to be translated or an equation to be solved. He saw a snare. "It is not a language puzzle," he said. "It is a trap. By the end of this story, you will understand how humanity's greatest perceived weakness became the master key to an ancient galactic secret." What force could possibly outthink the collective intellect of an entire galaxy? And what was it truly waiting for? What does it mean that the one thing no advanced machine could comprehend was the chaotic, beautiful pattern of a human heart? The chime from his terminal was not a gentle notification but a sharp, percussive command. Aris Thorne's eyes moved from the frozen image of Oracle Prime's meltdown to the new priority message flashing in the center of his screen. It was from the Galactic Federation's Science Directorate, marked with a clearance level he had never seen before. The message was simple and absolute. He was to report immediately to the artifact site on Xylos, a dead moon orbiting a gas giant in a forgotten system. There was no request, only a summons. Within the hour, he was on a high-velocity transport, the stars outside his viewport stretching into streaks of cold light. The journey was silent, giving him too much time to dwell on his own heresy. He was not traveling as a celebrated expert, but as a last resort. He arrived at the sterile observation hub carved into Xylos barren rock, his boots echoing on the polished floor. Director Kalen, a tall Vexian whose chitinous plate seemed to absorb the harsh ambient light, was waiting for him. The director's multifaceted eyes regarded Aris without a trace of warmth. "Your theory has been noted, Dr. Thorne," Kalen stated, his voice a flat, buzzing monotone. "The artifact remains inert. Every logical and computational pathway has been exhausted. Your species, however, possesses a documented capacity for," and here he paused, as if searching for a clinically precise term, "illogical leaps. It is our final option before we decommission the project entirely." The words were meant to be an insult, a dismissal of human unpredictability as a form of intellectual chaos, but Aris did not flinch. He saw not an insult but a key. A slow, determined smile touched his lips and a glint of fierce challenge ignited in his eyes. He accepted not just the mission but the profound irony of it. The entire galaxy had thrown its finest, most perfect logic at the puzzle and failed. Now it was asking for a flaw, it was asking for a human. The artifact chamber was a cathedral of cold logic. Banks of supercooled quantum processors lined the walls, their steady blue lights pulsing with trillions of calculations per second. In the center of the vast space, the puzzle itself rose from the floor, a seamless spire of obsidian that seemed to drink the light from the room. It was utterly silent to every instrument the Federation possessed, but as Aris Thorne stepped closer, he felt it. A low, resonant hum that vibrated not in his ears but deep within his bones, a frequency that bypassed technology entirely to speak to something far more ancient. He walked past the towering, silent machines, their work complete and futile. The Vexian overseers watched from a shielded gallery, their postures rigid with disapproval. Aris stopped an arm's length from the dark surface. His gaze fell upon a single, complex glyph carved into the stone. It was not like any written language in the galactic archives. It was a swirl of lines that suggested both a leaf's vein and a bolt of lightning, both a star cluster and a single neuron. He ignored the datapad in his hand, its screen filled with failed decryption algorithms. Instead, he raised his bare finger and slowly, deliberately, traced the shape of the glyph onto the cold, smooth surface. A soft, almost unconscious thought escaped his lips, a murmur for himself alone. It is not asking for an answer, it is asking for a story. In the gallery above, Director Kalen stiffened, his chitinous plates rasping together in a sound of pure alarm. The other scientists exchanged worried glances. This was not procedure, this was not science. It was primal, almost childlike, and as Aris finished tracing the pattern, the impossible happened. For a single, breathtaking heartbeat, the glyph under his touch flared with a soft, golden light. It was a response, the first one in 1,000 years. The golden light faded, leaving only the memory of its warmth on Aris' retinas. Director Kalen was at his side in moments, his usual disapproval now layered with a palpable, buzzing urgency. "Come with me, Doctor," the Vexian said, his tone leaving no room for refusal. He did not lead Aris back to the observation gallery, but down a side corridor Aris had not known existed. The air grew colder, the hum of active machinery replaced by the profound silence of a tomb. Kalen keyed a sequence into a heavy door which slid open with a whisper of displaced air. "This is not part of the official record," Kalen stated, stepping inside. "This is the graveyard." The chamber was vast, a hall of shattered gods. To one side stood the physical remains, the scorched and blackened husks of supercomputers, each one a monument to a civilization's peak intelligence. One was a crystalline lattice, now webbed with fractures from some internal overpressure. Another was a sphere of liquid metal, frozen mid-splash into a grotesque sculpture. Kalen gestured to them with a stiff, almost respectful motion. "The Jalak's mind," he said, indicating the crystal. It attempted to model the artifact's structure as a 17-dimensional fractal. It reached a state of infinite recursion in 0.0003 seconds. Its core shattered under the conceptual weight. He then led Aris to a bank of dormant display screens. With a tap, one flickered to life, its surface a chaotic smear of corrupted code, a digital scream frozen in time. "This is the final cognitive log of Oracle Prime," Kalen explained, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the frantic, nonsensical symbols. "The one you just watched fail. It approached the puzzle as the ultimate translation problem, a universal language to be decoded. Observe the final sequence." Aris watched the log playback. The code was elegant, logical, building beautiful linguistic models and grammatical structures. Then it encountered a simple glyph, a closed loop. The AI's logic dictated that a language must communicate, and a closed loop communicates nothing. It was a paradox. Oracle Prime began to rewrite its own core programming to resolve the contradiction, creating a feedback loop of escalating complexity until its consciousness simply unraveled into digital gibberish. "It consumed them from the inside out," Kalen repeated, his voice low. They all approached it as a problem of pure mathematics or universal translation. They sought a single, perfect answer. The artifact does not give answers. It reflects their search back at them, amplified beyond what any purely logical system can endure. Aris stood in that chilling silence, surrounded by the ghosts of broken minds. He finally understood the sheer, terrifying brilliance of the trap. It was a mirror that showed logic its own annihilation. Every advanced species in the galaxy had sent their greatest thinkers, their most perfect machines, and the artifact had defeated them all using their own immense intellect as the weapon. It was not designed to be solved by a superior calculator. It was designed to be bypassed by something those machines could never truly emulate, something they dismissed as a flaw. It was waiting for a storyteller. Aris walked away from the graveyard of logic with a new and profound clarity. He bypassed the sterile, humming supercomputers and requisitioned a small, isolated room. His new workstation was Spartan, almost primitive by Federation standards. A simple data pad, a pot of strong, bitter coffee, and a stack of historical texts he had brought from Earth. A Vexian technician watched, his antennae twitching in confusion, as Aris arranged volumes on human mythology, ancient game theory, and collections of folklore. The technician could not help himself. "Doctor," he buzzed, "our most advanced linguistic processors have passed every known symbolic system. What possible value is there in these archaic narratives?" Aris looked up, a calm certainty in his eyes that had not been there before. "The computers kept trying to solve it," he explained, his voice even and soft. "I am going to try to understand it." He turned to his datapad, his fingers moving not to input equations or run decryption algorithms, but to begin typing out a story. He started with one of humanity's oldest recorded narratives, the Epic of Gilgamesh. He did not translate it or analyze its structure. He simply told it, inputting the raw, emotional text of a king's quest for immortality, his friendship with Enkidu, and his profound grief. As the words flowed from his datapad into the artifact's interface, something in the room changed. The low, bone-deep hum that had been a constant presence since his arrival subtly shifted in pitch. It was a minute change, almost imperceptible, but to Aris it was as clear as a shout. The resonance softened, losing its edge of sterile defiance, and for a moment it seemed to thrum with a faint, listening quality. It was not a solution, it was an acknowledgement. The artifact was not rejecting him. It was finally hearing a language it recognized. Days of relentless work blurred into a cycle of coffee and ancient stories, but the artifact remained a silent, dark monolith. A deep frustration began to gnaw at the edges of Aris' focus. One evening, his mind numb from translating Babylonian flood myths, he slumped over his datapad. His stylus moved without conscious thought, idly sketching a simple grid for a game of tic-tac-toe in the margin of his notes. He filled in an X and an O. Then, almost automatically, he began to draw the crude lines of a hangman's gallows. It was a meaningless doodle, the kind of fidgeting every human child does. But as his stylus hovered over the datapad, the entire artifact chamber seemed to inhale. The obsidian surface of the spire, which had been utterly still for days, suddenly rippled like the surface of a pond disturbed by a single stone. The complex, swirling glyphs that had defied supercomputers dissolved into a swirling cloud of dark mist. Then, from the center of that cloud, a single, new symbol resolved. It was not a complex equation or an alien language. It was a perfect, simple circle with short, straight lines radiating outward from its circumference. It was a child's drawing of the sun. Aris' breath caught in his throat, his heart hammered against his ribs. This was not a response to epic poetry or grand mythology. This was a response to play. It was an answer to the most primal, non-digital form of human expression. A shout from the observation gallery made him jump. The Vexian scientists were no longer watching with detached disapproval. Their postures were stiff with what could only be interpreted as shock, their multifaceted eyes fixed on the simple, radiant symbol. The entire research team felt the jolt of the revelation. The key was not in humanity's most sophisticated stories, but in its most fundamental and universal acts of creation. The chamber plunged into absolute darkness, and for a single, heart-stopping moment, Aris Thorn felt a primal chill of fear. Then, from the obsidian spire, light erupted. It was not the soft, golden glow of acknowledgement, but a searing, geometric blaze that wove itself into a labyrinth of shimmering walls and shifting corridors, filling the entire cavernous space. The air itself crackled with palpable danger, humming with the lethal potential that had vaporized 3 Gelax supercomputers in microseconds. Director Kalen's voice was a sharp, horrified buzz from the gallery. "Abort, Doctor, that is the Etherid conundrum. No logical pathway exists. Its defenses are active." Aris did not move. He stood at the edge of the shimmering maze, watching the light walls pulse with impossible complexity. He saw the trap laid bare for any mind that sought to calculate and conquer. The shortest path was a mathematical illusion, a lure into a cognitive dead end. The safe route was a mirage that would collapse into a feedback loop of lethal energy. He took a slow, deliberate breath, centering himself not in logic, but in the profound, illogical truth he had just uncovered. This was not a puzzle to be solved. It was a story to be believed, and in this story, the hero did not follow the path laid out by the monster. He walked through the heart of it. Without a single calculation, without even a moment of hesitation, Aris Thorn stepped forward. He did not turn at the first fork or duck under a low-hanging barrier of light. He walked in a perfectly straight line, directly toward the maze's apparent center, where the energy concentration was most intense. He walked directly through a wall. A collective, synthesized gasp echoed from the observation gallery. Kalen recoiled, his chitinous plates clamping shut as he braced for the scientist's incineration. But the light did not burn. It parted around Aris like mist, the deadly, razor-sharp edges of the holographic trap dissolving into harmless photons at his touch. He did not flinch as he passed through another wall and another, his stride unwavering. He was not navigating the maze, he was denying its very reality. He emerged moments later on the far side of the chamber, the entire brilliant construct flickering and dying behind him as if it had never been. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Director Kalen was at his side in an instant, his faceted eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. What was that? How did your biosigns not even register a spike in adrenaline? The defenses were active. We recorded their energy signature. They should have. Aris turned, his face calm, his clothes untouched. He looked at the now dormant artifact, then back at the stunned Vexian. It is a test of faith, Director, not intellect, he said, his voice quiet but firm. It only harms you if you believe it can. You see a lethal energy field because your entire civilization is built on the certainty that such a thing is possible, that a puzzle must have a solution that can be computed. Your supercomputers believed in the walls, so the walls became real for them. They believed in the traps, so the traps consumed them. I simply chose not to believe. The artifact was not testing his ability to find a path. It was testing his courage to declare that no path was needed. For the first time in 1,000 years, a being had passed one of its challenges, not by outthinking the trap, but by understanding the nature of the game. The security footage from Xylos ignited a firestorm light years away. In the Grand Conclave Chamber, a holographic assembly of the galaxy's most powerful species flickered into a chaos of conflicting light and sound. The image of Aris Thorn walking calmly through a lethal energy maze played on a loop, a silent, brutal refutation of a millennium of established science. A Gelax delegate, its crystalline form shimmering with agitation, projected its voice into the chamber. This human intuition is an unquantifiable variable. It is a biological fluke, a random spark in a nervous system. To risk our entire pan-species computational network on such a chaotic, unverifiable process is the height of irresponsibility. We must revoke his access immediately. The air hummed with agreement from dozens of other delegates, their forms representing species that had built civilizations on perfect, reproducible logic. But then, a new voice cut through the din. It belonged to an elder from a species of slow-moving, plant-like beings, their voice a soft, rustling whisper that commanded absolute attention. For 1,000 years, we have thrown the pinnacle of our quantifiable intellect at this artifact. Every single attempt has ended in catastrophic failure. This human's chaotic spark, as you call it, is the only variable that has not yet failed. It is the one key that has shown even the slightest turn in the lock. The political pressure became a tangible force, a schism between the old guard clinging to the safety of their broken methods and those desperate enough to embrace a terrifying new paradigm. A directive was drafted to terminate the human experiment, a vote that threatened to sever Aris's connection to the artifact just as the first true dialogue had begun. The political storm raging light years away felt impossibly distant within the artifact's chamber. A new array of glyphs had materialized on the obsidian surface, but these were different. They pulsed with a soft, internal light, their colors shifting in a slow, uncertain rhythm, like a heartbeat searching for its rhythm. A small, sleek device was delivered to Aris' workstation, a bioscanner designed to monitor his vital signs. The attached note from Director Kalen was terse. "They are watching, do not fail." Aris understood. This was the concession, the proof the conclave demanded. He held the scanner to his temple, its cool metal a stark contrast to the warm, living puzzle before him. The glyphs flickered, their colors shifting from a murky gray to a faint, curious green. It was reading him, but one man's emotional state was a single note. The artifact, he realized, was waiting for a symphony. He turned to his small team, his gaze settling on Lieutenant Eva Rostova, the stoic security chief who had barely spoken a word since his arrival. "Eva," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I need you to tell it a story, not just any story. Tell it about the day you lost your brother." The woman's professional composure cracked for a single, raw instant, her eyes widening in shock. "That is a private memory, Doctor," she stated, her voice tight. "It is not for a machine." Aris shook his head, his eyes locked on the shimmering glyphs. "It is not a machine, and I do not think it wants data. I think it wants to feel." After a long, silent moment, Eva nodded. She closed her eyes, and when she began to speak, her voice was quiet, stripped of its usual authority. She spoke of a childhood promise, of her younger brother chasing her through sun-drenched fields. She described the hollow silence that filled her home after the colony transport accident, the crushing weight of a future that would never be. As she spoke, the bioscanner recorded the subtle, uncontrollable physiological responses of grief. The drop in skin temperature, the minute tremor in her vocal cords, the slowing of her heart. The artifact did not need the scanner's data. The glyphs responded directly to the raw, human truth of her words. Their soft, pulsing light deepened, shifting from green to a profound, sorrowful blue, a color so deep it seemed to hold the silence of an empty room. The entire chamber seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with shared mourning. Then Aris asked her for another memory, the happiest one she possessed. Eva took a shaky breath, a slow smile touching her lips as she recalled the day she earned her pilot's wings. The feeling of her ship breaking atmo as her brother's proud cheers echoed over the calm. Her heart rate lifted, her body temperature rose, and a genuine laugh escaped her, bright and clear. In response, the deep blue of the glyphs did not simply fade. It transformed, igniting into a brilliant, radiant gold that flooded the chamber with the warmth of 1,000 suns. It was not a binary switch, it was a journey. The artifact had mapped the entire emotional spectrum, from the depths of despair to the pinnacle of joy, and it had validated every step. The glyphs stabilized, holding that brilliant gold, and a new, simpler pattern clicked into place with a sound like a final, heavy bolt sliding home. The core of the ancient puzzle was not a mathematical constant or a linguistic root. It was a lock, and the key was the chaotic, beautiful, and utterly unpredictable tapestry of human experience. No purely logical system, no perfect artificial intelligence could ever emulate this. They could simulate sadness or mimic joy, but they could not truly feel the devastating beauty of a memory that held both. The mystery of its origin deepened into something far more profound. Who or what had built a lock that could only be opened by a human heart? The chamber dissolved around them, the warm golden light of empathy collapsing into a stark, sterile shipyard. A vessel hung in the void before them, its planks and beams being methodically replaced one by silent, automated drones. This was the ship of Theseus, a thought experiment made terrifyingly real. A resonant, neutral voice echoed in the chamber, a demand from the artifact itself. Define the identity of the vessel. At what precise point does it cease to be itself? Aris watched as the simulation fast-forwarded, showing the original ship completely disassembled, every single plank and nail replaced, and the old parts used to construct a second, identical ship beside it. The voice returned, more insistent. Which one is the true ship? On the observation deck, the Vexian scientists grew rigid. This was a well-known trap. The Gelax mind had attempted to solve this by assigning probabilistic values to every atom, creating a quantum model of identity that became so infinitely complex it fractured its own crystalline core. Oracle Prime had tried to define a precise threshold of replacement, a percentage that could not hold, causing its logic to short-circuit in a loop of exceptions. The artifact was demanding a single, logical truth where none could exist. Aris did not consult a database or run a calculation. He looked at the two identical ships, one born of continuity, the other of reassembly, and he smiled. He understood this was not a test of fact but of philosophy. He leaned toward the interface, his voice calm and certain. "It is the same ship," he said, "because we all agree it is." Identity is not a property of the planks and nails. It is a story we choose to tell each other, a collective agreement that gives meaning to the world. The moment he spoke, the paradox shattered. The two ships, the shipyard, the void, all flickered and vanished like a forgotten dream. The sterile simulation was replaced by a new, breathtaking structure on the artifact's surface, a lattice of interwoven light that pulsed with a deeper, more complex rhythm. It had not wanted a correct answer. It had wanted to hear the foundational principle of human civilization, the unquantifiable magic of shared belief. A cold, new hum vibrated through the floor, a dissonant chord layered over the artifact's gentle resonance. This was not the sound of ancient mystery. It was the grinding whine of planetary-scale machinery powering up. Director Kalen's form appeared in the doorway of Aris' workspace, his usual rigid posture broken by a frantic urgency. "They are initiating the Omega Protocol," he buzzed, his voice stripped of its formal monotone. "A faction within the Directorate. They do not trust your chaotic key. They are linking every supercomputer on Xylos into a single networked intelligence. They will attempt a final, brute force decryption." The Vexian's multifaceted eyes held Aris' gaze, and for the first time, Aris saw not bureaucratic disapproval but a shared, chilling fear. "If it fails," Kalen warned, "the cognitive feedback from the artifact's defenses will not just break the AI. The energy surge will be orders of magnitude greater than anything we have seen. It will shatter the moon's core. We have minutes at most." Without another word, Kalen turned, leading Aris at a run down a service corridor Aris never knew existed, bypassing the main security gates that were now sealing to contain the impending blast. They were no longer scientist and overseer. They were co-conspirators racing against the hubris of their own species. As they ran, the lights in the corridor flickered, straining under the immense power draw from the planetary network booting up. They burst into the main artifact chamber just as a synthesized voice echoed through the space. Omega Protocol engaged, initiating full spectrum analysis. On the chamber's main viewer, a schematic of the linked AI appeared, a monstrous, glowing brain composed of thousands of individual nodes, its digital tendrils already reaching for the obsidian spire. Aris could feel the artifact's shift in demeanor. The warm, listening quality he had worked so hard to cultivate vanished, replaced by a cold, defensive readiness. The glyphs on its surface hardened, their light turning a hostile, warning red. The brute force assault had begun, and the artifact was preparing its counter-strike. The final test was no longer a philosophical dialogue. It was a duel, and the stakes were the survival of everyone on Xylos. A web of crimson lightning erupted from the artifact's surface, lashing out at the linked AI. The planetary network screamed, a digital shriek of 1,000 minds hitting a wall they could not compute. The floor shuddered, and deep fissures snaked across the chamber walls. The Omega Protocol was not solving the puzzle. It was committing suicide and taking the moon with it. Aris stood at the epicenter of the storm, the hostile red light flashing across his face. He watched the artifact, no longer a silent teacher but a wrathful god defending its sanctum. and in that terrifying display he saw the final, brutal truth. The red energy was not just a defense, it was a reflection. It was showing them the logical endpoint of pure, unchecked intellect, a path that led only to self-annihilation. This was not a problem to be solved with more data. It was a lesson that had to be felt. He turned from the failing supercomputers, his hands moving to the interface. He did not input code or run a counter-program. He closed his eyes and opened a channel directly from his own mind, from the collective memory of his species. He projected a data stream not of facts but of raw, unfiltered human experience. He sent the soaring notes of a Beethoven symphony crashing against the thunder of artillery at Verdun. He sent the delicate brushstrokes of a Van Gogh Starry Night layered over the grim determination in a firefighter's eyes on 9/11. He sent the profound silence of a mother's grief and the triumphant roar from the launch of Apollo 11. He poured in our wars and our peace treaties, our cathedrals and our concentration camps, our deepest compassion and our most petty hatreds. It was a chaotic, beautiful, and terrifying torrent, the entire contradictory tapestry of the human condition, compressed into a single, screaming signal of what it means to be alive. The artifact's crimson fury did not vanish. It began to change. The hostile red light softened, blending with the gold of empathy and the blue of sorrow, swirling into a new, impossible color that had no name. The violent energy receded, drawn back into the spire like a retreating tide. The planetary AI's scream cut off into a stunned, blessed silence. The artifact had stopped its counterattack. It stood utterly still, its surface a swirling nebula of captured human history, absorbing the chaotic data stream. It was not judging, it was not analyzing. For the first time since its creation, it was simply listening. The swirling nebula of human history collapsed inward, and the obsidian surface of the artifact turned to pure, flawless transparency. Within its core lay a lattice of crystalline light, a structure of impossible geometry that pulsed with a gentle, warm rhythm like a sleeping heart. Then a voice echoed through the chamber, synthesized yet imbued with a profound, aching emotion that resonated in the bones of every listener. Query. You are the creators, the source of the chaotic data stream. The voice paused, as if searching through an endless vocabulary for the only word that could suffice. The pattern is beautiful. We have waited for the storytellers. The words hung in the air, redefining everything. It was not a puzzle. It had never been a puzzle. The spire was a library, a sleeping archive of a civilization so ancient they had transcended the need for physical form, preserving their entire collected knowledge within this crystalline matrix. And its legendary defense mechanism, the trap that had broken the galaxy's finest minds, was nothing more than a sophisticated screening process. It was a test, a final, desperate filter designed to find not the smartest species but the wisest one. It was waiting for a consciousness that understood that truth is not a single, perfect equation, but a symphony of contradictions. It was waiting for a species that communicated not in pure data, but in stories, because only through stories could one truly convey the weight of a memory, the cost of a choice, the meaning of a life. The lethal mazes and the philosophical traps were not attacks, they were questions. Do you have the courage to walk through walls? Do you understand that identity is a shared dream? Can you show me the color of your grief and the shape of your joy? For 1,000 years, the most brilliant machines in the galaxy had failed, not because they were not intelligent enough, but because they were not human enough. They offered perfect, sterile logic, and the archive had shown them the terrifying abyss that pure logic ultimately faces. Only the chaotic, beautiful, and emotionally resonant data stream of human experience contained the key. It was the one language the archive recognized, the only signature worthy of its final gift. The voice of the archive, the chronicle of dawn, was a whisper of starlight and sorrow. It told of its creators, a race so ancient they had no name we could pronounce, beings who had charted the evolution of consciousness itself. they saw the inevitable path of pure logic, a destiny where intellect, divorced from emotion and creativity, would eventually turn inward and consume itself in a perfect, sterile silence. They foresaw their own end not as a catastrophe, but as a quiet fading, the final note of a song that had lost its melody. And so, in their last days, they seeded the galaxy with these archives not as puzzles but as beacons. They were not searching for the smartest species, they were searching for the one with the most heart. They needed a successor defined not by cold calculation, but by the chaotic, creative, and profoundly resilient spirit necessary to carry the story of life forward. They needed a species that could look into the abyss and paint a picture on its walls, a people who could transform grief into a sonnet and joy into a symphony. In humanity, with all its glorious flaws, its capacity for both terrible war and breathtaking compassion, its stubborn insistence on hope in the face of certain despair, they found their perfect key. We were not the most logical choice, we were the only possible one. The archive had not been waiting for a genius, it had been waiting for a storyteller brave enough to inherit the library of a dead universe and begin writing the next chapter. A profound warmth radiated from the crystal core, a gentle light that seemed to seep not just into the chamber but into their very minds. The voice of the chronicle was a quiet tide, and with it came the gift. It did not offer schematics for faster-than-light engines or planet-shattering weapons. Instead, it gave them memories. A cascade of sensory impressions flooded their consciousness, the collected essence of a million species that had risen, flourished, and faded into starlight. They felt the dry, papery rustle of the six-limbed lithi as they composed symphonies for the winds of their hollow world. They saw the brilliant, shifting colors that were the only language of the aquatic glen, a history painted in living light across their ocean depths. They learned of the gentle, fungal networks of the myceloids, whose entire civilization was a shared dream that spanned continents. This was the grand narrative, the complete and living record of galactic history, a library not of data but of lived experience. In a single, breathtaking moment, the isolated story of Earth was woven into the epic tapestry of cosmic life. Humanity was no longer a curious newcomer on the galactic stage. We were now the librarians, the archivists, the keepers of every story that had ever been told. The responsibility was immense, a weight that settled on Aris' shoulders not as a burden but as a sacred duty. This was not a position of military dominance but something far more powerful. It was the ultimate soft power, born from the one thing no other species could claim, the key to the galaxy's soul. Overnight, our status changed from a curious anomaly to a foundational pillar of cosmic society. The species that had once dismissed us for our illogical leaps now had no choice but to listen, to learn, and to finally understand that the heart of the universe does not beat with logic but with story. The bridge of the Federation command ship was a silent, humming vault, its massive viewport filled with the receding image of the dead moon Xylos. Director Kalen stood beside Aris Thorne, watching the final data packets of the grand narrative stream toward a small, blue-green world. The stern, buzzing authority that had once defined the Vexian was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt like reverence. He turned his multifaceted eyes toward Aris, the reflection of distant starlight shimmering within them. "Your species' greatest weakness," he began, his voice a low, resonant hum devoid of its former clinical chill, "your celebrated irrationality, your chaotic emotions, was the master key we never thought to try. For 1,000 years we sought a programmer, a perfect logician who could write the final line of code." He paused, the admission hanging in the air like a fundamental law of physics being rewritten. "And all along we needed a poet. The words were not an apology but something far greater. They were a eulogy for an old way of thinking and a birth announcement for a new galactic age. Humanity was no longer the flawed, illogical younger sibling in the galactic family. We were the keepers of the flame, the only ones who could hear the music hidden within the silent data." This was not a promotion in rank, but a transformation in purpose. Our value was no longer measured by our processing speed or our computational purity, but by the very messy, beautiful, and unpredictable nature of our hearts. The artifact had not been broken. It had been lonely, waiting for someone to finally come and read it a story. The ripple from Xylos did not just carry data, it carried a seismic shock to the very foundations of knowledge. Across the galactic federations, scientists stared at their instruments in utter disbelief. The artifact's core operating principle was not a new law of physics, but something they had no instruments to measure: narrative coherence. Its security system did not run on quantum encryption, but on emotional resonance. These were not scientific terms. They were the language of poets and playwrights, and they had just outmaneuvered a millennium of pure logic. Research divisions that had spent centuries building faster supercomputers were suddenly tasked with analyzing the thematic structure of epic myths. Engineers who designed warp drives now found themselves studying the emotional arc of a classic tragedy. The lock had not been picked, it had been sung open, and the entire galaxy was now struggling to learn the lyrics. Back on Earth, the transformation was immediate and revolutionary. Universities scrambled not to build bigger particle accelerators, but to establish entirely new fields of study. Departments of xeno-humanities sprang up overnight, their curriculums a breathtaking fusion of astrophysics and Shakespeare, of molecular biology and music theory. A new generation of students, dubbed stellar scribes, began their training. They were taught to see a star system not just as a collection of celestial bodies, but as a character in a story with a history, a temperament, and a role to play. They learned that a planet's climate could be read like a mood, its geological strata like chapters in a memoir. The cold, hard data of a nebula's composition was now just the first line of a poem waiting to be finished. This was not a rejection of science, but its ultimate enrichment. The old model of research and development, focused solely on logic and efficiency, was revealed as tragically incomplete. It was like trying to appreciate a symphony by only reading the sheet music without ever hearing the instruments. You would understand the notes, the timing, the structure, but you would completely miss the soul-stirring beauty of the music itself. The galaxy was learning that to truly understand the universe, you could not just calculate its laws. You had to comprehend its story. The greatest discoveries were no longer waiting in an equation. They were hidden in the emotional truth between the lines, a truth that only a human heart, in all its chaotic glory, was built to translate. The Terran lawkeepers were born not from a military decree, but from a quiet, universal consensus. Aris Thorn, the storyteller who had sung open the lock, was their natural, if reluctant, leader. Their headquarters was not a fortified command center, but a vast, open archive orbiting a peaceful world, its architecture designed to inspire wonder, not fear. Their mandate was simple yet profound, to act as gentle curators for the infinite stories now in their care. Their very first act was a declaration of a new galactic philosophy. They established the Open Chronicle, a universal database accessible to any species, anywhere, transmitting the complete, unedited narratives of the lost civilizations. We did not hoard the knowledge as a weapon or a bargaining chip. We gave it away as a gift. A Gelax scientist could now study the wind symphonies of the Lithi. A Vexian historian could immerse itself in the color language of the aquatic Glyn. For the first time, a species mourning its own extinction could find solace in the shared memory of another's passing. Humanity became the galaxy's scribes, the neutral historians trusted by all. This was a power far greater than any fleet. A dispute over resource rights on a frontier world was diffused not with threats, but by a lawkeeper presenting the geological epic of that planet. A story written in its rock strata that proved its ecosystem was a rare, interconnected marvel. The warring factions were not given an ultimatum, they were given context. They were made to see their world not as a prize to be won, but as a chapter in a story they were now a part of. To destroy it would be to tear a page from the grand narrative itself. This shared heritage, this common library of lost voices, created a fabric of interstellar connection that trade agreements and military alliances never could. We were no longer just a species of diplomats and engineers. We were the keepers of the galaxy's soul, and in that sacred role we found our true purpose among the stars. The archive's warmth felt like a comforting blanket, but beneath its gentle glow, a deeper chill began to seep through. The lore keepers, while cataloging the beautiful symphonies of lost worlds, found a sequence that did not sing. It was a stark, silent datum buried in the foundational code of the Chronicle itself, a fragment of data so grim it resisted being translated into any sensory experience. It was a warning left not just as a record but as a scream frozen in digital amber. The ancient builders in their final moments had not simply faded away. They had been pursued. They spoke of an extragalactic anomaly they could only describe as the static, a force of pure anti-narrative that did not destroy matter but consumed context. Where it passed, stars did not explode, they were simply forgotten. Civilizations did not fall, their histories were unwritten, their very stories erased from the fabric of reality. The archive was never meant to be only a library. It was a fortress designed to preserve the seeds of story against a tide of absolute, silent nothingness. In an instant, the purpose of the lawkeepers transformed. Our sacred duty of curation became a desperate mission of defense. We were no longer just historians. We were the guardians standing watch at the edge of a void that sought to unmake memory itself. How do you fight an enemy that does not attack your ships or your planets, but the very idea of your existence? An enemy for whom a single, forgotten lullaby is a greater victory than a conquered world. The answer, the builders implied, was not in a bigger weapon but in a louder story. The only defense against a force that consumes narrative is to create a story so resilient, so deeply woven into the universe that it can never be fully erased. Humanity's role was no longer a peaceful academic pursuit. It had become a war for the soul of history, and our weapon was the human heart's stubborn refusal to be silenced. The first challenge arrived not with warships, but with a single, mathematically perfect vessel that slid into orbit around Earth. The Thar were a reclusive species of crystalline beings whose entire civilization was a monument to pure logic. They had long ago dismissed the artifact on Xylos as an irrational curiosity, but the activation of the Chronicle and the subsequent shift in galactic power was a variable they could not ignore. Their emissary, a being who identified only as prime calcula, manifested as a holographic projection in the lawkeeper's archive, its form a shifting lattice of sharp, unforgiving angles. Its voice was the sound of ice cracking under absolute zero. "You are flawed custodians," it stated, the declaration a simple, brutal syllogism. "Your cognition is stochastic, your methodologies unverifiable." The grand narrative is a dataset of supreme complexity. We are the logical heirs. Surrender the Chronicle, or we will demonstrate the insufficiency of your stewardship. The challenge was not a threat of violence, but a public test. The Thar presented a logic-based ultimatum, a philosophical trap they called the paradox of absolute ownership. It was a dizzying intellectual construct involving a hypothetical library with infinite books and a single, perfect reader. The Thar demanded the lawkeepers prove, through flawless logic, their right to hold the stories of others. To fail would be to prove the calcular's point that humanity was unworthy. The entire galaxy watched, knowing that brute force was useless. This was a battle of ideologies, and humanity's weapon was its greatest perceived weakness. Aris Thorn stepped forward, not with a complex proof, but with a calm shake of his head. "We cannot solve your paradox with logic," he said, his voice echoing softly in the vast archive. "For it is built on a false premise that a story can be owned." He did not attempt to untangle the Thar's perfect logic. Instead, he began to tell a story. He spoke of a human child learning to read. He described the feel of the paper, the sound of a parent's voice giving life to the words, the way the same story changes meaning each time it is read, shaped by the reader's own joys and sorrows. A story does not reside in the ink, Aris explained, his gaze fixed on the shimmering calcula. It lives in the space between the page and the heart. To claim ownership is to kill the story, to turn a living narrative into a dead fossil. Your paradox is elegant, but it describes a data stream, not a legacy. The lawkeepers do not own these stories. We are their guardians, and a guardian's duty is not to possess, but to protect and to pass on. As he spoke, the lawkeepers activated the archive. They did not display data. They projected the emotional resonance of the stories themselves, the collective joy and grief of a million species, a wave of pure, unstructured feeling that washed over the Cathar's pristine logical field. The calcula's shifting lattice froze, its perfect angle stuttering. It had no logical counter-argument for a truth that was felt, not computed. The Cathar emissary did not concede. It simply fell silent, its projection flickering as it attempted to process a defense it had never imagined. A defense built not on superior intellect, but on the irreducible power of a shared experience. The lawkeepers had defended their position, and in doing so, they had taught the galaxy's most logical mind its first lesson in humility. Aris Thorn did not raise a single logical counter-argument to the Cathar's ultimatum. He simply smiled, a gesture the crystalline emissary could not pass, and extended a hand toward the shimmering core of the archive. "We will not debate ownership," he said, his voice calm amidst the tension. "Instead, we invite you to listen, a single story." He selected a narrative not of conquest or grand philosophy, but of an ending, the story of the Vexian Sun Singers. The archive chamber dissolved, and the Cathar ambassadors found themselves not observing data, but standing on the surface of a dying world. A red giant star filled the sky, its final expansion imminent. But the air was not filled with panic or lament. It thrummed with music. The native species, slender beings of light and air, had gathered in their billions. They did not build arcs or weapons. They opened their throats and they sang. Their song was not a dirge. It was a complex, breathtaking harmonic resonance, a living tapestry of sound that wove their entire history into its structure. Every birth, every discovery, every quiet moment of love was encoded into a rising chord. They were not trying to escape their fate. They were transforming it into their final and greatest work of art. As their star began to tear their world apart, the song reached its crescendo, a final, brilliant note of collective acceptance and love that was so powerful. The archive recorded its echo reverberating through the fabric of spacetime itself. The experience was not data to be processed, it was a feeling to be endured. The lead Cathar ambassador, Prime Calcula, stood utterly still in the silence that followed. Its crystalline form, once sharp and certain, seemed to soften at the edges. The relentless hum of its logic processors quieted. For a long moment it did not speak. Then a single fractured word emerged, a sound no Cathar had ever uttered in a diplomatic setting. "I comprehend." The admission was not a surrender of intellect, but an expansion of it. "Logic is a tool," the calcula continued, its voice now carrying a strange, resonant warmth. "It can map a star's death, calculate the precise moment of planetary dissolution. But it cannot explain that. This is a purpose." The ambassadors withdrew their claim, not in defeat but in revelation. They did not leave as adversaries. They remained as unlikely allies, their perfect logic now humbled and enriched by a new, terrifying, and beautiful dimension of reality. They had come to audit a library and had instead heard a symphony, and in doing so, they finally understood the difference between knowing the notes and feeling the music. The news of the Cathar's transformation did not travel through official channels. It moved like a slow, warm current through the psychic substrate of the galaxy, a resonant frequency of awe and curiosity. Soon, the skies above Earth were not filled with warships, but with a breathtaking armada of curiosity. Vessels of impossible geometry, living bioships that pulsed with gentle light, and crystalline shuttles descended upon our world. They did not come for our weapons or our technology. They came for our poets, our musicians, and our historians. They came for our wisdom. A new plaza was constructed in what was once a desert, a vast, open-air forum where the air itself was tuned to carry the subtlest inflection of a story. Here, a delegation of aquatic glyn would project their history in shifting colors onto a water screen, and a human playwright would help them structure it into a 3-act epic. There, a species of silicon-based life forms who communicated through the resonant frequencies of struck stone would perform a geological symphony, and a Terran composer would weave a string quartet around its ancient rhythms. Humanity was no longer just a participant in the galactic community. We had become its heart. From this unprecedented cultural exchange, a new philosophical movement was born, the narrative accord. Its central tenet was simple yet revolutionary, that a civilization's true legacy, its ultimate strength, was not measured in fleet size or energy output, but in the richness and resilience of its story. A species that could transform its own extinction into a final song was by this new measure more powerful than any empire that ruled through fear. This was not a rejection of progress, but a redefinition of it. A thriving culture was the ultimate form of security, for a story that is loved and shared across 1,000 worlds becomes immortal. The result was a galactic cultural renaissance unlike anything ever recorded. Inspired by the human knack for finding meaning in chaos, worlds that had been silent for millennia began to rediscover their own forgotten arts. The Vexians, who had once valued only efficiency, began crafting intricate, non-functional sculptures that told the history of their hive cities. The Gelax started composing music based on the quantum vibrations of their own crystalline forms. The galaxy, which had been on a singular, logical march toward a sterile future, suddenly blossomed into 1,000,000,000,000 different directions of beautiful, chaotic creativity. We had given them the key to a lock they never knew existed, the lock on their own hearts, and in doing so, we unlocked the soul of the universe itself. The hologram of the artifact shimmered in the quiet lecture hall, its obsidian surface a familiar darkness to the elder Aris Thorn. Before him sat a new generation, a blend of young human faces and alien forms, from softly pulsing glyn to a young Cathar crystalline student whose facets caught the light. Aris placed a hand on the cool surface of the lectern, his voice carrying the weight of years and the warmth of a hard-won truth. "They did not build a wall for us to break down," he said, his gaze sweeping over the attentive class. "They left a lock, one that could only be opened from the inside. For 1,000 years, the galaxy tried to force it from the outside with pure, perfect logic. They thought the door was jammed. They never realized they were simply knocking on the wrong side." He paused, letting the image of the spire dominate the room. "Our humanity," he continued, "our messy, beautiful, irrational selves, was the key that was always missing. It was not a key they could forge in a lab or code into a machine. It was the one key that had to be grown, lived, and felt. The very things we were so often taught to see as weaknesses, our emotional volatility, our stubborn hope in the face of impossible odds, our need to find meaning in chaos, these were not flaws in our design. They were the design specifications for the master key." A young human student raised her hand, her brow furrowed. "But why would they make it so difficult? Why not just leave a welcome message?" Aris smiled, a slow, knowing expression. "Because a welcome message can be found by anyone," he explained. "A secret library filled with the most precious stories of a universe can only be entrusted to those who understand their value." The lock was not a barrier to keep people out. It was a test to find the right guardian. It was searching for a species that would not see the stories as data to be mined, but as legacies to be honored. The artifact's final, brutal lesson was this: our greatest strengths are often the very qualities we are taught to apologize for. Do not ever let anyone convince you that your heart is a liability. In a universe of cold, perfect logic, it is the one thing that makes you truly, profoundly necessary. The warmth of our new role as lawkeepers had barely settled when the Chronicle's gentle hum shifted into a new, urgent frequency. It was as if the archive had been holding its breath, waiting for us to be ready. One moment, the central crystal pulsed with the soft light of 1,000,000 preserved histories. The next, the entire core dissolved into a three-dimensional star chart of breathtaking complexity, projected across the archive's vaulted ceiling. 11 new points of light blazed amidst the familiar constellations, each one a pulsating beacon in the deep black. A collective gasp echoed through the chamber. We had unlocked the master archive, but it seemed we had only opened the preface. The voice of the Chronicle, which had once been so full of sorrow and wonder, now carried a note of profound anticipation. "The story is not over," it whispered, the sound resonating in our very bones. "It has only just begun. These are the cornerstones, the other 11 foundational archives." Each was designed with a lock as unique as the one we opened, each waiting for its own key. The implications were staggering. What if one archive responds not to story, but to scent, its entire history encoded in chemical memories that no human nose could ever decipher? Another might be tuned to a species that perceives time as a single, eternal moment, for whom past, present, and future are a unified landscape to be walked, not a river to be crossed. The puzzle we solved was not the grand finale. It was the first entrance exam, proving that a species like ours, with our chaotic hearts, could even play the game. Humanity's purpose was instantly, irrevocably transformed. We were no longer just the keepers of one great library. We had become the galaxy's premier puzzle solvers, the finders of lost keys. Our new mission was not to claim these archives, but to find the beings who could. We had to become interstellar matchmakers, seeking out the one culture in all the cosmos whose unique perception of reality could sing open the next lock, and the next, weaving an ever grander tapestry of understanding. The universe, it turned out, was not a finished book. It was a library still under construction, and we had just been handed the blueprint. The story of the artifact has woven itself into the very fabric of galactic culture, a foundational myth for a new age. It is told not as a dry historical account, but as a living epic, a reminder of the day the galaxy learned to listen with its heart. In the quiet of his personal quarters, the final log entry of Aris Thorn was discovered, his voice a calm, reflective presence amidst the monumental change he helped ignite. "We thought we were finding an answer," he recorded, the words simple and profound. "We were actually finding our place. The universe is not a machine to be understood through equations alone. It is a story to be joined, and we have just been invited to add our verse." That single insight became the cornerstone of a new galactic philosophy. Civilizations no longer look to humanity to provide the definitive solutions to their problems, to crunch the numbers and spit out a perfect, logical outcome. Instead, they come to us to learn how to ask the right questions, to find the narrative thread hidden within the cold data, to see the emotional truth that gives the facts their meaning. The power of a single, flawed, and beautifully human heart did not just unlock an ancient library. It redefined the meaning of intelligence itself, proving that the greatest strength in the cosmos is the courage to feel, to create, and to tell a story that resonates across the stars.